Hello, everyone. Welcome to 15 Minutes and a Big Idea. We are into the final section on head coverings. And as I mentioned last time, this is going to be a bit of a longer episode. We've walked through the text specifically, and then last week we looked at why I don't think Paul is saying this is a transcendent expectation for all men and women, respectively, everywhere in all settings. And today I want to try and talk about how it actually does apply. Some comments here. In this case, number one, these are my views. They don't reflect the views of the Mended Collective. Number two, I don't have the definitive word here. It's meant to advance the conversation and work it out in your local community. I will say, as far as the disclaimers get on all the things I do and don't mean, this is so complicated, and we may just have to have a sit down, like a 1 hour sit down with somebody across on a microphone on this, and I might consider doing that. But the decision tree gets really complex here, and situations get really very hard. And so speaking in general is almost counterproductive, but we have to do that. We try to speak clearly and generally, but bear that in mind and be cautious and always use these principles with discernment in that. Next, I want you to remember that all these episodes go together, that you may say, well, how is he getting that? And I would encourage you to listen to the last 6, 7, 8 episodes, whatever it's been, that allow us to look at these things. And like I mentioned last time, I ran more unapologetically long than I think I ever have. And we may do that again this time because there's so many questions here where this is the rubber meets the road. And I want us to try to have this be a set of usable principles for all of us and usable studies that you can direct people to and that you can be a part of and we can use to bless the kingdom of God. So that kind of gives you where this is going to go because there's so many questions here. And I do want to try to speak into a little bit of it so that we can get our hands messy. Obviously, question and response episode, probably mention that next time, and looking forward to diving in. Again, we're going to read all of it to get our hands dirty and get this in our heads and in our hearts. 1 Corinthians 11, 3 through 16. But I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of a woman, and God is the head of Christ. Every man who has something on his head while praying or prophesying disgraces his head, but every woman who has her head uncovered while praying or prophesying disgraces her head. For it is one and the same as the woman whose head is shaved. For if a woman does not cover her head, have her also cut her hair off. However, if it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, have her cover her head. For a man should not have his head covered, since he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of man. For man does not originate from woman, but woman from man. For indeed, man was not created for the woman's sake, but woman for the man's sake. Therefore, the woman should have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. However, in the Lord, neither is woman independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as the woman originated from the man, so also the man has his birth through the woman. And all things originate from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does even nature itself not teach you that if a man has long hair, it's a dishonor to him? But if a woman has long hair, it's a glory to her. For her hair is given to her as a covering. But if anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor have the churches of God. Today, I'm excited to get to the question of application. And sometimes we phrase this question as, do head coverings apply today? Or does 1 Corinthians 11 apply today? Obviously, the first half, 3 through 16. And I prefer to phrase it as, how does the head covering passage apply today? Or how does 1 Corinthians 11, 3 through 16 apply? All scripture is given by God to change our lives and to make us useful for service. And so I think it's important that we assume every verse has an impact on how we live in some way. The question is really then, what is that impact and how does it impact? And I recognize this is a semantic difference, and I don't mean to be pedantic about this. I really don't. But for myself and from my perspective, and I just want to share this for you to consider, it's important to not fall in the trap of thinking there are parts of the Bible I can ignore or not take seriously because, well, they don't really apply and I don't have to know them. That said, we've got to be careful because we need to rightly interpret and apply the word of truth in that way. So that said, we do need a quick summary. You can go back to the last episode or just listen to all of the episodes before that. Either of those are great, but Paul begins with the theme of headship, which is a designation of authority. Christ is the head of every man, a man is the head of his wife, and God is the head of Christ. For the Corinthians, this means that wives should wear these head coverings when doing religious activities, while men should not, as a cultural symbol of this transcendent ordering. We argued last time from the context and the systematics, that God has not given this as a transcendental rule for all churches, but a need for the Corinthians of the day. We took a lot of time to unpack that and talk about why that is. As we mentioned, today we're going to talk about the principles that certainly are transcendent and apply them to our big idea, which is display God's design with cultural coherence. Display God's design with cultural coherence. That is the big idea for today. Our supporting ideas are: number one, complementarianism is biblical. Number two, head coverings in proper settings. Number three, physical appearance is communication. Complementarianism is biblical. Head coverings in proper settings. And three, physical appearance is communication. Complementarianism, proper, and communication. Our first supporting idea is that complementarianism is biblical. Now, that may sound like a mouthful, but complementarianism is the word that describes the roles of men and women. That is, men and women have distinct roles and responsibilities in a marriage and in the church, and they don't have equal authority and decision-making power. God has given us unique callings as part of our biology that are different. You know, most fundamentally, our biology gives us different roles in reproduction and procreation. That's just abundantly obvious. This is, ninth grade biology. That means that human reproduction requires two different types of people, a man and it requires a woman. And they both bring something necessary to the equation, and they have a mutual dependence on one another. They can't make it without each other. They're both required. Neither is intrinsically better or worse than the other. They're just different. There's no intrinsic difference there. That said, the reality of the difference has implications for how we interact. Those biological differences further manifest in other strengths and weaknesses in other areas of life, and as such, God has called us into different roles and responsibilities based on His structure and design. I do want to say one quick thing about this. We are speaking generally. We're speaking generally about men and women. You can find some differences in potential outliers, but those are just that. Sorry, I'm getting caught in the middle of this now, and now I'm trying to give qualifiers and qualifiers and qualifiers. This is part of why I say the decision tree gets difficult, is that every man and every woman is different and every relationship is different. But we do need to make sure that we're trying to conform to God's pattern to the best of our abilities. And so we need to recognize the uniqueness that every person and every marriage has, but we also need to not use individuality and uniqueness to excuse what God's calling us to. That's what I'll say. So how's that for a midstream disclaimer? Let me catch up where I am and in my notes here. Okay. As we mentioned, this passage is clearly teaching that within marriage, husbands have the responsibility to lead. This is the way that God has designed it. This does not mean that men are intrinsically better or superior to their wives, and certainly to all women. The relationship of every man to every woman is hardly in view in this text at all, if it is in view at all. This does not mean that men are intrinsically better or superior to their wives, and like I say, certainly to all women. This passage is very clear about that. Note that God is the head of Christ, and as such, Christ submits to the Father, but Jesus is just as much divine and in no way intrinsically inferior. As such, there should not be any tyranny in headship. That a headship that takes on a tyrannical role is not a biblical headship and is an illegitimate use of that authority. While one may call those who lead to do things that are hard for them, they're doing that with their best interests in mind and the best interests of others, and they're choosing to suffer and serve first before they call other people to. When husband and wife are walking as joint heirs of Christ, Galatians 3, 1 Peter 3, they're walking in the Lord. There's a lot of cases where this is going to look really similar, that they're going to be walking and it may seem with a lot of equality, and that's good. That's how things should be from my perspective. That said, there is a difference in roles and leadership. There is equality in these distinct complementary roles, and that is biblical. That is biblical. For our second point, we want to ask about the modern-day practice of head coverings and where sisters might have an obligation to participate, and likewise, brothers have the obligation not to participate. And I want to quickly point out, and I don't know how many times I've said this, I think I've said this a few times, But the male side of this is just as crucial to Paul's logic as the other part of this. Often we think about, do ladies have to do this? Because it's the part in our culture that we don't really see. But it often goes overlooked, and you can really test interpretations by do they deal with that difference coherently. First, as I said earlier, this is a cultural symbol of headship, and as such, the wives in Corinth were obligated to participate. Paul seems to be obligating them to participate. I'm inclined to think that this was something that sisters in general would and did participate in, even if they weren't married. At this time, marriage was kind of the common state for most women, and it seems that women did this in religious contexts in general, so it would have been a more normal thing to do. That said, I'm remarkably less sure of that conclusion for unmarried women, widows, and young girls and things like that. I'm not quite sure. But what are we to make of head coverings today? Okay, what are we to make of them today? I don't believe it's a transcendental reality, but many of the principles in 1 Corinthians 8 and 9 around not giving offense and not hindering the gospel certainly apply here. So if you're in a church setting where everyone holds the conviction that sisters should wear head coverings, I would suggest that out of love for others, you should do that, especially if they view that as a symbol of submission to their husbands. If they view this as hey, this is the way we all honor our husbands, then that's something that one should do. And I would suggest that out of love for others. If nothing else, part of the biblical notion of modesty is moderation and not sticking out like a sore thumb. Obviously, this applies to wearing clothes that are seemly in the amount of skin they expose, but more generally to being moderate in the things that we wear. I think this also speaks to more general practices that we've got to ask ourselves about wedding rings and taking husband's name and all that sort of stuff. And I realize cultural sensibilities around that are changing. But we've got to ask ourselves, is this a way that people in my setting consider that one brings honor to their husband? And if it is, perhaps it's a way that I need to do that, whether or not you hold that it is or isn't. I believe it's a cultural thing because there's places where people don't really have surnames, so it's a cultural thing. But in our culture, in many places, it represents, taking your husband's name represents that authority structure. And so that's something we need to take into account. In my judgment, men not having heads covered in prayer and prophecy is not transcendent either. And yet, in basically all the churches I'm a part of, men don't wear hats in church, and even in prayers in private settings, they'll take a cap off. And so, in general, I comply with that tradition. I don't believe that we're under an obligation to do that necessarily, because I don't believe this text is transcendent. But we've got that tradition. People do that. They have that sensibility, and unless a tradition is leading to fleshliness or unfaithfulness, there's no benefit to overturning it. I know that we're kind of, in our cultural moment, we're coming out of a season of anti-traditionalism, and actually we're kind of reverting back to traditionalism, which is interesting. But coming out of that anti-traditionalism, anti-establishment sort of deal, it's like, let's turn over everything. It's like, well, we don't need to turn over everything. We just need to turn over the bad stuff. And so, there's just there's no need to thumb our nose at tradition, unless it's leading to fleshliness, or by doing that, we could lead to more love in other people. So last, I want to make a general remark about this text and a principle that I would, I think I would have recited before the beginning, but is really cemented in my mind. And this applies to both men and women. And that's, as our supporting idea says, that our physical appearance is communication. It is a form of communication. Contextually, our hairstyle and our clothing is communicating things about us. Now, God looks at the heart of people, and there are certainly things about our outward appearance that are not matters of our control. For example, male and female, not something that you can control. God has given that to you. He's made you a man, or he's made you a woman. And so that's not something you can control. You present to that, and people see that. My skin color, I can generally pick up a little bit of a tan in the summer, but there's kind of a range that I've got. And I'm not going to have super, super dark skin. My facial features, my height, the proportions of my legs to my torso. You want to talk about things that I might like to change. I wish I had longer legs and short, but I got this like squatty. Anyway, you don't care. But anyway, my massive forehead that y'all have to look at every week. These are all things that I have very limited control over. And so as I look at those things, I might have some level of self-consciousness about them, but it's not any active choice on my part. I'm not really communicating much by them. It's just if people look at them, I kind of just, roll my eyes and say rain on them because I just can't control that. And in general, it's wrong of us to look at a person and make spiritual judgments on the basis of these things. And it's wrong for other people to make such a judgment on us on the basis of those things. That said, there are things that are generally within our control, and it is not necessarily wrong for people to draw preliminary conclusions about the sort of person you are, your character, based on what you display for people to see that is within your control. Now, I want to say quickly here, there's some level of things that are outside of control that are theoretically within control. Like, the clothes you wear, if you're poor and you've only got one set of clothes, it's going to be dirty. Is it necessarily in your control? Probably not necessarily. Whether it be various other things that wealth allows us to control more. That's actually a thing, right, in this analysis. But those are all communicating things. I want to give you a crass example of this, because you may be like, well, it's just not fair for people to look at me and draw judgments. If I wear a T-shirt that says, I heart Satan, I don't. But if I say that, I wear a T-shirt that says, I heart Satan, I'm certainly communicating something to people. Like, that attire is a declaration of something. I'm certainly communicating that I'm not a Christian by this outward expression. People are certainly fallible in these assessments. They are, and they're unfair, and it's all that sort of stuff. But we've got to be honest about, number one, what we're trying to communicate. What am I trying to communicate with the way I present myself and what's within my ability? And two, what am I actually communicating? Because sometimes we're trying to communicate one thing with our actions and what we do, and we're not actually, it is not coming in for a landing with everybody else. And I've been guilty of both of those things. The clothes we wear and the ways we style our hair are integral to this. We need to make sure our intentions are motivated on the glory of God and the blessing of others, but we also need to literally and metaphorically look ourselves in the mirror and ensure that our intentions are being received. There have been many times in my life, and some of you knew me as a teenager, that my style was communicating things I didn't intend. I didn't intend to. But the way that I presented myself shared with people a certain heart, which was somewhat fair. And while there's a line where we're, unnecessarily submitting ourselves to the tyranny of people pleasing, like there's a line there where you just try to conform and all that sort of stuff, and you're basically just a people pleaser and it's about pride. There's a line on the other side where you're just like thumbing your nose at people and not being effective in what you do. We've got to make ourselves slaves for others so the gospel might be advanced, and that may include our physical dress and all those sorts of things. All right, I just checked my time. This is going to be the longest one, so thank you for bearing with me here. I hope you've enjoyed our study and our lessons on this text, and we are going to ask some questions here. As we think about this text, there's things that are very foreign to us. But there's also things that are deeply applicable to our settings. I want to quickly say a word to our sisters who may be wrestling with this text, and you feel some conviction to implement the practice of head coverings that are found in this passage in settings where it's not your cultural convention, right? You're like reading this passage, like, I think God's calling me to do this, and you're understanding all that. I want to respect your conscience and all those things. We've all got to make the best decision we can. But I do want to quickly remind you of the logic of this text. What's the logic of this text? This is about a couple things. It's about fitting in with cultural expectations and not sticking out, and it's about giving honor to your head, not yourself. Okay, it's about cultural expectation. It's about fitting in, and it's about giving honor. So if you are trying to attract attention, if there's a heart of pride in you that wants to appear spiritual and be like, I read 1 Corinthians 11, and now I'm wearing this, look how spiritual I am, and I know I stick out like a sore thumb, but I actually kind of like sticking out like a sore thumb. You are defying the logic of this passage. You may be obedient in the outside practice, but your heart is not lining up with this heart here. Likewise, if you're practicing this in a way that thumbs your nose at your husband or your church leadership, then you're not being obedient to this passage. If you feel convicted to do this, I love you. I love you very much. I receive you as Christ has received me, okay? Wherever that lands and all those sort of things. But you've got to be obedient, not just to the outward displays of your heart, but to God's expectations for your actual heart. So when I call you into that if you feel the need to practice this in a way that to the best of your abilities and your conscience aligns with cultural expectations and gives honors to those in the proper positions. Okay, so questions. We haven't had questions in a long time, but I want to say these things to you. Do you have a heart that seeks to uphold God's design for home in the church, or are you subtly trying to undermine it? Whether it be by overstating your role as a man or a woman, or pushing past what God has called you to, or abdicating your role because someone else will pick it up, are you doing your best to complement the part that God has called you into? Number 2, are your intentions with the way you present yourself physically? Are you intentional with the way you present yourself physically? Do you have a pure heart that works to make Christ and the glory of God known, or are you about self-promotion by accentuating parts of your body evocatively, working to demonstrate your wealth and show the nice brands that everybody can see, or are you just being tacky, unkempt, and attention-seeking? And finally, are you actually communicating what you tend to and hope to? Do you meet your intention with the way that you dress and the way that you have your style and grooming and all that sort of stuff? Are you willing to ask others with spiritual insight about potential blind spots to open yourselves up so that you can ensure your body is a living, breathing testament to the glory of Christ and not to yourself? Thank you so much for joining us today here at 15 Minutes in a Big Idea. Today's big idea: display God's design with cultural coherence.